Our main program today is the last of the Seattle Times series conceived by Mike Shepard and by Mark Wright, who worked together over the course of this year to bring you early breaking stories, new critical stories that the Times was working on. Today is, of course, no exception when our topic is about the $15 minimum wage discussion. This month, Seattle Mayor Ed Murray announced a deal between labor and business to get all workers to a $15 an hour wage over the next 7 years. Our panelists will discuss the when, the why, and the how of this proposal and its implications. So as they come to the stage, I'll introduce each. Lynn Thompson will moderate. Lynn is a reporter from the Seattle Times. She's worked there for 13 years, and she covers education, local governments, youth violence, and legal affairs. Lynn's a graduate of the University of Washington, Boston U. Howard Wright. Howard Wright is co-chair of the mayor's 24-member Income Inequality Advisory Committee and CEO of Seattle Hospitality Worldwide, an event management firm. Tracey Thompson is secretary-treasurer of Teamsters Local 117, representing 16,000 workers in the state and 200 employers. Taylor Hoang is the chef owner of Pho Cyclo. Those are 5 restaurants in King County. She's also a leader of the Minority Small Business Coalition. And finally, Nicole Vallestero-Keenan is policy analyst for Puget Sound Sage, a nonprofit focusing on jobs and housing for everyone. Please join me in welcoming them to our stage.
Thanks very much for having us here. I want to thank Mark Wright for inviting us, and Carol Carmichael, who's the assistant managing editor at the Seattle Times, who worked with Mark on putting this program together. Our Howard Wright and Nicole Vallestero-Keenan were both on the Mayor's Income Inequality Committee, and Tracey and Hoang have both been, I'm sorry, Tracey and Taylor have both been very involved in the issue as well. So I was going to start by asking Howard to give us the outlines of the proposal that the committee recommended to the mayor, and the mayor in turn has sent it on to the city council.
Great, thank you. And thanks for having us all here, Lynn. You called a week ago to ask if I could be here, and I looked at my calendar, and I'm supposed to be one floor up at the Arts Forum Luncheon. But so this one saved me a little money, so I appreciate it. Thanks very much. So, you know, The Weekly last week ran an article, and the headline was, Tears, F-bombs, and hell knows, how they got to yes. So I don't think there'll be any of that going on in this luncheon today. So anyway. But in all seriousness, it's a pleasure to be here. The IIAC was appointed in late December, early January to get going on the mayor's plan for $15. And a great deal of work, 24 people, working with Nicole, my co-chair, David Rolfe from SEIU, chaired the labor side of it. I co-chaired the employment side of it. I think one of our other colleagues, David Watkins, is in the room today representing the hotel industry.
And Craig Dodson.
And is Craig here too? Good, Craig, hello, somewhere? There you are. So a great deal of community effort went into this. And I didn't quite realize how remarkable it would be that we would even get to a recommendation. I've been civically aware, but not civically engaged. And for us to set a recommendation to the mayor after 4 months of hard work, the last month of those 4 months was every day, every night, to get to a plan to take the city minimum wage from present state level of $9.32 to $15, as short as beginning in 3 years and as long as ending in 7 years. And 3 years to 7 years is determined by the size of your company and the type of whether you offer health care benefits, and also whether employees receive tips and gratuities and other forms of income. And so that's a very short, brief description. And of course, happy to any of us to go into details, and I understand there'll be some time for questions and answers afterwards.
Right.
Yeah.
Nicole, tell us about who in Seattle makes less than $15 an hour, what we know about workers in the city, and who would benefit from an increase.
So there's about almost 1 in every 4 people who work in Seattle make below $15 an hour. It's about 102,000 people. A majority of the folks that make under 15 are women, people of color, and immigrants. So that is an overrepresentation of particularly women and people of color that are in low-wage jobs. The average person making under 15 makes $11.95 an hour and works 32 hours a week. That means they're living off of $19,000 a year.
Tracey, the unions have been very involved across the country in the push for a $15 minimum wage. Tell us about why the unions got involved and what you see a $15 minimum wage bringing for workers.
Well, I think the unions have gotten involved largely because of the overwhelming income inequality that exists in our country, and it started obviously with the fast food workers and their push for a living wage, a $15 minimum wage, which has sort of gone across the country, and our Walmart, which is another effort on the part of workers to achieve a wage that they can take care of their families on. And it's interesting because a lot of people say to us, well, why would unions want to push for non-represented people to get a higher wage? And the reason is because we care about workers. We want workers to be able to take care of their families. So the unions in this region have really taken the initiative to push forward, both in the people that we elected, like Mayor Murray, and Kshama Sawant, people who are committed to increasing the minimum wage for workers in Seattle. And we believe firmly that that's the right thing to do.
Taylor, tell us how you got involved and how this proposal will affect particularly small businesses and ethnic-owned businesses.
I got involved right around March when the issue was getting more press. Prior to that, I heard about it, but didn't really think that it was going to move that fast or that quick. And so I got involved starting in March just for my own business. I have about a little bit over, depending on the season, about 60 employees. And we employ mostly immigrant workers from Vietnam, from China. We have some Latinos. And for me at that time, it was what the impact would have been for my business. But as the issue grew bigger, I started to pull in other business owners in the community. And the community as a whole, especially the Vietnamese and the Chinese community as a whole, was very upset over the issue, because they believe that it would be detrimental to their business, to their, not just for them, but for their employees as well, who they also employ a lot of immigrant workers. And as we started to learn more about the process, what the mayor was doing, the community, the ethnic community, felt strongly that our voice wasn't being heard, even through the mayor's office on the task force. Last year, 2013, the city of Seattle generated about $2.1 billion in sales through restaurants, and 24% of that was restaurants owned by ethnic minorities. And so for a community that large to not have their voice heard at the table with the mayor's task force and even through the mayor's office was very very difficult for the community, because the ethnic community has a very different dynamic and structure in how they do business compared to the mainstream business. And so I got kind of voted in as the de facto person representing the community, just because of my connection to the community. I grew up in the community. My mother still owns her own business on 12th and Jackson. And, being able to speak English, being able to communicate, and then communicating the information and facts back to the community. So that's how I got involved.
Thank you. Howard, when you signed up for this, You didn't know what you were getting into. Tell us what your goal was. Why did you want business to be at the table, and what were your expectations?
Well, the verb signing up is an interesting interpretation. But so some of you know that when we had the two finalists running for mayor, I would ask at various fundraisers or public events like this where they were on $15, because my family business, we have a hotel down in SeaTac, and I knew about the $15 Prop 1 down there, and I just asked them what they thought of it, the two finalists, and they both were in support of it. It passed in SeaTac, and Seattle also elected a mayor who was in support of $15, and also elected a city councilwoman who ran on a platform of 15 now. So it became pretty clear to me that this was coming to Seattle. So, a lot of my friends and even some close family members said, how can you get involved with this, and how can you support this? And I said, it's not really about if it's coming to Seattle. It's coming to Seattle. So let's figure out how to get ahead of it. And then, long story short, is they asked me to serve on what ended up being called the IIAC committee. I agreed to be on it. Like any good Seattleite, I thought, yeah, sure, an hour a week for 4 or 5 months, and the other people will do the heavy lifting. They called a week later and said, would you be co-chair? And I didn't really understand what that meant. I'm still not sure I do. But anyway, so I did. And it was an amazing experience. So again, going back to how I got involved and why I worked so hard on it. So to everybody in the room, I look at you and say, I respect your opinion if you don't support the $15 goal. But I came at it from a different point of view to say that I believe that it's coming. As an employer of 400 people here in the city, I wanted to get out in front of it to make it the most acceptable form that we could. And with respect to some of our labor colleagues here in the room, what I didn't like is what happened in SeaTac, that it was effective 7 weeks after it passed, that it did not take into account any tips, gratuities, things like that. And I really do. I have a great relationship with the labor community, but in SeaTac, not a lot of people know that if you have a collective bargaining agreement, if you're a union operator there, they are excluded from the $15 minimum wage, and I didn't think that that was right. So it's coming to Seattle. Let's see what we can do to make it the most acceptable form that we can.
Thank you. Tracey, talk about why we're even talking about a $15 minimum wage. What, why is that before us now? Why $15, and what could it mean for the city?
Well, I guess why 15 is an interesting question, because some of us believe it should have been higher, given the inflation rate of the minimum wage and the costs of living in the city of Seattle. A one-bedroom apartment, the average rent is $1,358 a month. So you're talking about $7.63 an hour if you work 40 hours a week, and trying to pay your rent and live on $9.32 is really challenging. And from unions, from labor's perspective, 15 resonated. And it certainly gives families and working people a meaningful chance to be able to participate in our economy in a meaningful way, to take care of themselves and their families, and to essentially have a living wage. And that's where 15 came from.
Thanks. Taylor, talk about what concerns the minority-owned business and small business have, and what changes you would like to see now that the bill's before the City Council.
Oh, well, there's a lot of changes we would like to see, but I don't think that's feasible at this point. Being a business owner like Howard, I try to stay ahead of the issue and see how that would affect my businesses. I think the unintended consequence of the mayor's proposal is for the really micro business in our city, which can include both immigrant and non-immigrant business owners. The reason is that within the restaurant or small business, the profit margin is very, very slim. It's about anywhere from 3, if you're lucky, 5%. My business, we run on a 3% net profit margin. That's if we're really tight on our numbers. We would like to see it go up to 5, but we're at like maybe 3 or 4% on a good year. So I'll share a story with you, a quick story about how I got into the restaurant business and how where my mother and I arrived here in the country in 1983. And before 1983 in Vietnam, before the war, she was a nurse. But once we arrived in the U.S., after the war, she was sent to concentration camp because my father was part of the U.S. Army, and he fought for the South. He came to the U.S. in 75 through the U.S. Army. My mother and I was left behind. So she went through concentration camp. She went through boot camp, a number of persecution from the government. And finally, through my father's sponsorship, we arrived in Everett in 1982. And she was really sick at that time. She couldn't go back to school, and it would take her years to earn a living to pick up her nursing degree again. So the one thing that she can rely back on, and this is true for a lot of immigrants, is what she knows, which is how to cook. That's how a lot of immigrants go into business for themselves, because there's very limited entry barriers for them to go into business. So she opened up her own first restaurant, and then eventually she opened her restaurant now, which sits on 12th and Jackson in the ID district. So prior to 2009, she's the oldest of 12 brothers and sisters. She has 11 sisters, and she has 1 brother. And she has about 30 nieces and nephews that she supports still to this day to put through school. So she opened up her business in the ID. She put myself and my brother through college. And prior to 2009, before the economy tanked, she was doing okay. She was not doing well. She probably make about anywhere from $60,000 to $70,000 net a year. As of last year, her net income was $24,000. And why? It's because there's a huge dynamic change in the immigrant community. So in the ID, when I grew up in the 80s in the international district, that was the only place you can go to get food, to get groceries, or your ethnic food in the ID or in the Little Saigon. But nowadays, all of that has changed. As my generation grew up, we're moving to the suburbs. My parents are no longer coming back into the community to shop, and we're not coming back into the community to shop. So there's a slow migration out of the ID and the Rainy Valley and so forth. So business there has been going down slowly. Then on top of that, you have all the constructions that the city is placing on the business there. For my mom, it was the streetcar. For a whole year, the streetcar project was there. So her business dropped another 30%. She comes in the morning, the city shut down her water for 6 hours. She has to close up. Come in the next day, they shut down the electricity for another 5 hours because they're doing construction. She doesn't get compensated. None of the businesses in the ID get compensated when they're doing these type of construction. So as of last year, 2 years ago, she moved in to live with me, not just to be closer to my family and my kids, but also because she can't afford to live on her own. She employs 4 employees, and a lot of times when new immigrants come, we take them in, even though they don't speak English, they don't know the lay of the land, but as a new immigrant, that's where they go to the previous immigrants or the immigrant owners that they know from previous, from their old country or whatnot, to give them a job. And so we open the door and we give them a job. So when I talked to my mother the other day when this whole thing started, that this is going to happen, and we were sitting over, she doesn't come home till about 9:30 at night. She works 7 days a week, 8 hours, from 8:30 in the morning to 9:30 at night. And by the time she sits down for a snack, she and I, my kids gone to bed, we sit down to eat, and I told her this, and she just burst out crying. She said, how can I make my business work? How am I going to survive this? How am I going to support my family in Vietnam when I barely have anything left to support them on? And now I have to do a 60% increase. And so when I sit at the table and within the mayor's office or a discussion table, and the other side, the 15 now said, well, that's just fear. Fear is getting a hold of you guys, and fear is pushing your community to ask for things that's very unreasonable. And I said, it's very true. Fear is huge. Fear is a big factor in all of our lives, right? That's why 15 Now slammed their door and raised their banner and said, 15 now. Why not 11 now? Why not 12 now? It's 15 now. It's because it's to strike fear into all of our hearts that this is going to happen. And so it's the same thing for the immigrant community. It's huge. It's fear that's striking in their hearts. And my mother's story is not unique. If you go into Chinatown, if you go into Rainier Valley, you speak to any of the business owners, and the fear is real, and the story is real, and it's pretty much the same across the board. So that's why when, this whole issue is discussed in the public attention, and the committee was put together, the voice of the immigrant community wasn't added. It wasn't heard, and the fear wasn't heard. And so now the unintended consequence is that this policy has to go into effect for them as well.
Taylor?
And we're going to see a lot of, people moving out of the city.
Yeah. I wanted to get to Nicole and ask her, sorry. Nicole, what do we know about other cities and states where they've adopted a higher minimum wage? 61% sounds really high. Washington State already has the highest minimum wage in the state. What's happened at other places where the minimum wage has been raised?
So there's a number of other cities across the country that already have done a local minimum wage increase. So Santa Fe implemented a 65% increase in 2004. They went from $5.15 an hour to $8.50 an hour, and a number of different studies were done after Santa Fe increased their minimum wage. I encourage all of you to look them up yourselves, but I can summarize. There was a study conducted by Santa Fe City Council that looked at what happened in the restaurant industry. And granted, this is a move from $5.15 to $8.50, but this is also 10 years ago when that was a lot more money. And the restaurant industry actually went up in jobs. Why? Why does this happen? You might wonder. One of the reasons is when more low-wage people spend all of their income to get by. So if you have somebody who's making $30,000 a year, they're spending 100% of their income on the things they need. If you're talking about somebody who's making $70,000 a year, they're spending 60% of their income on the things they need and saving and doing other things with that money. And so one of the reasons why you see jobs go up in certain industries, even though there might be job losses in other ways, is because people have more money to spend. And so that spending effect of having more money in low-wage workers' pockets actually increases their spending. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when you move somebody from $19,000 a year to $30,000, so that's what 932 to 15 is, their increased spending at restaurants goes up by 45%. So that's a big jump in an income. It means that you can afford to have lunch out every now and then, as opposed to not being able to having to pack a sandwich lunch every day. It means that maybe if you want to go out to eat, you can afford to do so. In San Francisco, they raised their minimum wage locally in 2000, and well, they did an airport one and then a city one. They raised theirs about 10 years ago as well. And they have a really great enforcement structure that they put forward. So they set up an Office of Labor Standards that does audits. So instead of an employee complaining and then they send a letter to the employer saying, hey, you violated, pay this person back, what they do is they actually audit the company itself, which is very encouraging to employers to actually follow the law. Because it's bad for business if you have people who are undercutting and not following the rules when you're the one following the rules. And there was another one in Oakland, San Jose. Oakland's actually looking at raising their minimum wage right now. San Jose just increased theirs to 10, and we have Chicago and New York and San Francisco all looking at 15 right now.
Thank you. Howard, talk about the decision by the committee to recommend this different tiers, so large businesses are treated differently than small businesses, businesses with health care are different, restaurants, tips are different. Can you explain a little bit the rationale?
So the goal from the beginning, I believe, was to make this as acceptable to as many people as we could for the end result. And that took into consideration, large companies, small companies. I know that, we shouldn't try to differentiate by brand. The labor side of the discussion had very strong goals and descriptions for some of the largest big box and fast food employers who provide nothing other than a straight minimum wage, and how to get them to pay more. There were also some unintended consequences. We have some very good large employers here in our community, not the least of which are Starbucks and REI. And what do? I mean, it's in their DNA to provide great benefit packages. They may not pay as much, but they provide great benefit packages. And I hated to see that not get recognized. And I worked with my colleague behind the podium here, Craig Dawson, who explained to us a lot about the minority community and what the unemployment rate is for youth in the minority community. And when you get to a $15 minimum wage, those of us in the room who are employers, $15, we may be getting a four-year graduate from the University of Washington applying for their first job. But we also may be getting a young man or a young woman out of the minority communities who haven't had the educational advantages, have not had the resume advantages, have not had the interview advantages, maybe haven't even had any job experience. And so now you've got two people applying for a $15 minimum wage. Which one are you going to hire? So that's another unintended consequence. So this was sort of a large tent, if you would, on how we could make this mostly acceptable to not only the employees but also to the employers. So under fewer than 500 employees, you have 3 to 4 years to get there. Larger than that is, fewer than 500, you have up to 7 years if there's tips and healthcare. Larger, it's in 3 to 4 years.
I'm getting the high sign that it's time to take questions from the audience. So I think our people are going to be walking around. Yeah, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll, if you want to direct it to one panelist or ask all of them.
A question, please. Thank you very much to all of you for being here today and for all your work in this very important issue. How does the mayor's proposal address internships, trainees, etc.? Maybe high school students, college age, etc. Please. Thank you.
I was saying we should rock, paper, scissors for it.
That's good.
Do you want to take this one or do you want me to? Go ahead. Okay. So in general, the mayor's proposal adheres to state law if it's not explicitly mentioned in the proposal. So according to state law, employers can apply for specific waivers. Only 200 of them really exist, so you have to actually really qualify to pay a sub-minimum wage. In terms of internships, legally, you can't replace a job with an internship. So if you have a position that is a job, and then you say, I don't want to pay this person anymore, and then you make it an internship, that's actually not legal. A lot of people do it anyway. But a legal internship is a training program where a person learns, is part of a school program, and that's how the state defines it. So as far as I understand, the ordinance itself follows state law in all other areas.
And you may have seen in the Seattle Times this morning was an editorial to take that into consideration, a training and teenage wage, which would be 85% of the new minimum wage. As you know, it's going to change each year for up to 7 years. I don't know where that's going to go. I do know that there's a very short fuse on this process, short fuse on the process at City Council. So it's gone from the mayor's office down to City Council. They're discussing it and having public hearings for 2 weeks. There's another one tomorrow at noon at City Hall that's open to everybody. Full committee will be there, all 9 council members. And then they'll be voting on it. Oh, it's at 9? 9 o'clock tomorrow,
9.
thanks. That's why I told you it was at noon. Good.
No, I would tell them it's at noon.
We got
It's
too
at
many
5
people
at
showing up
McCormick and Schmidt's.
from their side. Just joking.
A question.
So anyway, it'll go on for a couple more weeks, and then it'll go to full council for a vote.
A question from the loquacious and lovely Laurel James.
The hugger.
Hello, Howard. I'm just thinking back when I started my business, and you guys are totally screwing up people who want to start businesses. And that, from my standpoint, is not even a democracy. You're asking us not to start businesses. You're asking us to pay $15 an hour and or with whatever environmental agencies you want to add to it. So what do you do about people like Dick's Drive-In, who does a great job with their employees? There's a lot of us out here that did a great job hiring people, and we were new in the business when we never could have had a business if we'd have had to pay $15 an hour.
You know, Washington State already has the highest minimum wage in the country, and Washington State is at the top of new jobs by small businesses in terms of, and so already we're already at the top, even though we have that highest minimum wage in the country. I know it feels like a lot, but that's the whole point about the phase-in, is that if you're a new business starting off, you're going to be, you're going to be phased in as a small business, and it's there's a lot on both sides of this issue, and frankly, it's going to be kind of interesting to watch it evolve and to really see the impacts. But it's our belief that, at least from labor's perspective, and obviously we want jobs to be created, that there won't be a significant negative impact on the development of new businesses.
Thank you. We have a question over here, please.
Sure. If I could just add to that, and pardon me for 1 second, if I could just add to that, I understand where you're coming from, but if I could wear my pragmatist hat for a moment, this $15 or a much higher minimum wage up toward $15, in my opinion, respectfully, was coming to Seattle. So we needed to figure out a way to make it most acceptable. And if you don't like the fact that $15 was coming, obviously none of us can personally, help that. But this community, the polling shows in our community a tolerance for a higher minimum wage. CTAC passed a $15 minimum wage. The city of Seattle, until our last election, we all voted for city council members citywide, elected a socialist city councilwoman who ran on 15 now. And I've just learned 10% of the registered voters in Broadmoor voted for her. So I can't explain that, but it's true. And I can't explain that. And this is a very serious subject, but this was coming to Seattle. So we were given the charge to figure out how to make it mostly acceptable, and nobody starts $15 next year. And at the end of 7 years, the last group gets to $15. So I appreciate your opinion, and thank you for your question.
Thank you. Can one of you give some information, historical basis of minimum wage and economic trending to say today, what it would be if it had kept up with the economy, and what it would be 5 years or 7 years down the line if there are some economic projections?
Sure. Nicole's going to take most of that answer, but I do want to say that as an employer, here's one of the pieces of research that I learned, and remember, as an employer here in Seattle, 400 people. So back in the 60s and 70s, it took 55 to 60% of a region's median wage to have a decent middle-class standard of living, which meant a place to rent or a mortgage payment to pay, a couple of kids, and a car payment. In 2012, the median wage in the Puget Sound region was $25.50. 60% of $25.50 is within a couple of pennies of $15 an hour, and we as a state are paying $9.32. So that's how I got more comfortable with what I thought was this extraordinary $15 goal. And I realized that we were going to help people earn more money, that eventually, hopefully, they'll spend it at some of my places. So that's how I got there as an employer. And then Nicole has the statistics to your question.
So if we did nothing, like we didn't raise the minimum wage, we just kept with the state, we would be at $15 in 17 to 18 years. So we're, in essence, speeding up the timeline. And if you look at if the national minimum wage, and one of the things that's great about Washington State is that year to year, people who make minimum wage are not earning less every year because our wage ties with inflation. In other states, their minimum wage doesn't tie with inflation, so basically people who earn minimum wage and don't get a raise are making less than they were the year before. So if the federal minimum wage just tied with inflation since when it was started, our minimum wage would be over $10 for the whole country. If it had tied with the rate of productivity, our minimum wage would be $15 to $22 an hour. So 15 is kind of on the low end of what our productivity as a country is, and the lowest wage workers' share of that.
Can I add to that? I think any of us on this panel, including myself, we all agree that, we need to be, our staff need to be paid higher, to help everyone to get to a minimum wage. But I think for me, it doesn't come down to just the dollar. It comes down to many other things that we as a community and as a city need to do to help elevate these people up to a point where they can make better wages, which includes training, includes support. And this policy is so big and affects so many people and so many parts of our community that it can't be passed, and it shouldn't be passed within a 4-month period. It has to be thought out, and it has to be better policy, better study to go into it. And I think the problem that I have with it is trying to lump everybody, like the Dick's Drive-In, the training wage, the immigrant community, in with all of the bigger business to try and make one package fit for everyone. And I think there's so much more that we can do to help elevate income rather than just the dollar amount.
We've run out of time. Sorry, I think there was one more question. But I want to thank all our panelists for being here today and sharing their thoughts with us. And thanks to the Rotary for having us.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.